The world is too loud. It is a constant, uncompressed stream of garbage data. People think silence is the absence of sound. They are wrong. Silence is simply the absence of signal. There is always noise. The thermal agitation of air molecules, the 60-cycle hum of the electrical wiring in the walls, the low-frequency rumble of the refrigerator compressor cycling on and off in the kitchen. I sat at the dining room table, pushing a pea around my plate with a fork. I was wearing my headphones. They were Bose QC45s, big, bulky, over-the-ear cans. To my daughter, Sarah, and her husband, Mark, they were a sign of my decline. A sign that Grandpa Bill was checking out, retreating into the shell-shocked silence of his old age. They thought I was listening to static, or maybe classical music to soothe my frayed nerves. They didn't know the headphones were turned off. The passive isolation blocked out the high frequencies, the clinking of silverware, the wind against the window. But it let the low frequencies through, and more importantly, it acted as a filter. It allowed me to focus. I wasn't deaf. I had the hearing of a bat. I could hear the bearing grinding in the dishwasher fan 3 rooms away. I could hear the hesitation in Mark's heartbeat from across the table. It's a disaster, Sarah. A complete catastrophic failure of the narrative, Mark was shouting. He was pacing the length of the dining room, his Italian leather shoes clicking aggressively on the hardwood. Click, clack, click, clack. A 120 beat per minute tempo of panic. Mark was 40. He was the PR director for Vanguard Aviation. He wore suits that were too tight and cologne that smelled like desperate ambition. I have CNN on line 1, the NTSB on line 2, and the stock prices in freefall in the after-hours market, Mark yelled into his Bluetooth earpiece. No, I told you. Pivot to the pilot error angle. The telemetry was ambiguous. Use that word. Ambiguous. I took a bite of my steak. I chewed slowly. My jaw clicked. It was a slight temporomandibular joint issue, a legacy of clenching my teeth while listening to people die on magnetic tape for 40 years. Crunch. Mark stopped pacing. He pulled the phone away from his ear. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and exhaustion. Sarah, Mark hissed at my daughter. Can you please tell your father to stop chewing so loudly? It sounds like a rock crusher. God, he's deaf as a post. Sarah looked at me. She looked tired. She was trying to keep the peace between a husband who was drowning in corporate malfeasance and a father she thought was senile. Dad, she said, raising her voice, pantomiming a chewing motion. Softly, please. I nodded. I didn't speak. I hadn't spoken more than 10 words a week for the last 5 years. It was easier that way. Words add to the noise floor. Mark went back to his call. Listen to me, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that projected perfectly in the room. The crash in the suburbs, it looks bad. I know it looks bad. A 2-ton autonomous cargo drone turning a family's garage into a crater tends to look bad. But the XM9 prototype is flawless. The AI is perfect. It had to be the remote override. The pilot panicked. He disengaged the logic core. He listened for a moment. I don't care if the pilot is in a coma, Mark shouted. He can't defend himself. Leak his personnel file. Did he have a drinking problem? Did he fail a sim test 3 years ago? Find something. We need a scapegoat before the market opens tomorrow, or Vanguard is finished. I looked at Mark. I analysed the waveform of his voice. Tremolo in the lower register. Deception. Rapid spikes in pitch. Fear? Glottal fry at the end of sentences? Exhaustion? He was lying. He didn't know if it was pilot error. He just needed it to be pilot error. Fine. Send me the raw data, Mark snapped. I'll listen to it myself. I need to know what we're up against before the feds get their hands on the primary drive. He hung up. He slammed his phone onto the table. It slid across the mahogany and hit the centerpiece. Thud. He sat down, putting his head in his hands. They're going to crucify us, Mark muttered. Vanguard stock was at $400 yesterday. It's at $280 now. If this is a system failure, the contract with Amazon goes away. The contract with the DoD goes away. We're bankrupt. He opened his laptop. He typed furiously. What are you doing, Mark? Sarah asked gently. Come eat. The food is cold. I can't eat, Mark said. I just got the encrypted dump from the drone's black box, the CVDR cockpit voice and data recorder. I stopped chewing. The CVDR. The Holy Grail. The orange box that isn't actually black. The memory of the machine. I have to hear it, Mark said. I have to hear the pilot screw up. If I can hear him scream, if I can hear him panic, we have our story. He hit a key. The sound erupted from the laptop speakers. It was tinny. Laptop speakers are garbage. They have no bass response. They distort anything over 80 decibels. But the sound was unmistakable. Screech. It was the sound of aerodynamic stress. The sound of air moving over metal faster than the metal wants to go. Then the alarms. Pull up. Terrain. The synthetic voice of the drone's collision avoidance system. Cold. Monotone. Then the pilot. Or rather, the remote operator sitting in a trailer in Nevada, connected via satellite. I can't hold it. She's pitching down. Disengaging auto. Manual control. Why isn't she responding? God. Oh God. Then a noise that sounded like a gunshot. Bang. Then static. Mark slammed the laptop shut. See? Mark said, his eyes wild. He panicked. Why isn't she responding? That means he lost situational awareness. He stalled it. It was a stall spin. Classic pilot error. Sarah looked pale. That sounded horrible. It sounded like a lawsuit, Mark said, rubbing his temples. But it's a winnable lawsuit. If the pilot lost control, the machine is safe. The stock recovers. I stared at the laptop. My heart rate had slowed down. My breathing was shallow. Mark heard screaming. He heard alarms. He heard the narrative he wanted to hear. I heard something else. I heard the ghost in the machine. Underneath the alarms. Underneath the synthetic voice. Underneath the wind noise. I heard the hum. It was faint, maybe minus 40 decibels relative to the noise floor. But it was there. A low-frequency vibration, constant, rhythmic. I closed my eyes behind my sunglasses. I ran the sound through the spectral analyzer in my brain. Pitch, approx 400 Hz. Waveform, sawtooth. Modulation, increasing amplitude. 400 Hz is the standard frequency for aircraft AC power systems. But this wasn't electrical hum. Electrical hum is clean. This was dirty. It had harmonics. It had a physical texture. It sounded like teeth. Metal teeth chewing on metal. I hadn't heard that specific sound since 1998, the crash of a McDonnell Douglas MD-80 off the coast of California. The jack screw failure. The sound of a stabilizer stripping its threads in mid-air. Bill? Mark's voice cut through my processing. Hello? Earth to Major Tom? I opened my eyes. Mark was waving a hand in front of my face. You didn't hear any of that, did you? Mark sneered. just happily eating your peas while my life falls apart. I looked at Mark. I looked at the laptop. I'm going to bed, Mark announced, standing up. I have to write a press release. Vanguard Aviation mourns the tragic loss caused by operator disorientation. That sounds empathetic, right? He grabbed the laptop. He grabbed the USB drive that was sticking out of the side. Clean up the table, Bill, Mark said as he walked out. Make yourself useful. I watched him go. I waited. I waited for Sarah to clear the dishes. I waited for her to kiss me on the forehead and tell me to get some sleep. I waited for the lights to go out. I waited for the house to settle. I sat in the dark living room for 2 hours. I listened to the house breathe. I heard Mark snoring upstairs. It was a jagged, irregular snore. Sleep apnea. He should get that checked. I heard the settling of the foundation. Creak! I stood up. I didn't move like an old man. I moved like a shadow. I walked up the stairs. I knew exactly where the squeaky floorboards were. The 3rd step. The 7th step. I stepped over them. I reached the door to Mark's home office. It was ajar. I slipped inside. Mark was asleep in the guest bedroom down the hall. Sarah had kicked him out because of the snoring. The office was empty. The laptop was on the desk, closed. Next to it was the USB drive, the little silver stick that contained the death of a family and the lie of a corporation. I picked it up. It was cold. I put it in my pocket. I turned and left the room. I walked back down the stairs. I didn't make a sound. I walked to the basement door. I opened it. The smell hit me first. Dust, ozone, old paper, the smell of my life. I walked down the wooden steps into the darkness. I pulled the string on the overhead light. Click. My basement was not a normal basement. It was a bunker of sound. The walls were lined with acoustic foam wedges. The ceiling was treated with bass traps. The door was solid core oak with a rubber seal. In the centre of the room was my rack. It was a beautiful chaotic altar to analog fidelity. A Studer A807 reel-to-reel tape machine. A vintage Tektronix oscilloscope with a glowing green CRT screen. A bank of equalizer units, Neve, API, Pultec, and my speakers. Genelec 1031A monitors, the most honest speakers ever made. If a recording sounded bad, the Genelecs told you it sounded bad. They didn't lie. I sat down in my Aeron chair. The mesh groaned slightly. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket. I plugged it into my modern interface, a pristine digital to analog converter that fed the signal into the vintage gear. I put on my real headphones, not the Bose toys I wore upstairs. These were Sony MDR 7506S, the industry standard for 30 years. I closed my eyes. Let's listen to the truth, I whispered. I hit play. The sound flooded my ears. Screesh. It was painful. The digital compression of the original file was jagged. I reached for the equalizer. Filter, I muttered. High pass at 200 Hz. Low pass at 5 kHz. I turned the knobs. The wind noise vanished. The tinny rattle of the laptop speakers was gone. Now I had the raw mid-range. Pull up, pull up. Not interested in you, I said to the synthetic voice. I used a notch filter. I swept the frequency until I found the exact pitch of the alarm, 1.2 kHz. I cut it by 20 decibels. The alarm faded into the background. Now I had the pilot. I can't hold it. She's pitching down. I listened to his voice. The stress tremors were real. He wasn't lying. He was fighting the controls. Why isn't she responding? I isolated the background. I boosted the gain on the ambient track. There it was. The hum. I routed the signal to the oscilloscope. The green line danced on the screen. It wasn't a smooth sine wave. It was jagged. It looked like a mountain range. I zoomed in. The frequency was stable at 410 Hz. Actuator motor, I identified. Electric. High torque. But there was a secondary frequency riding on top of it. A subharmonic. Clack, 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 clack. I counted the beats. The frequency of the clacking matched the rotation speed of the primary drive shaft, but the amplitude was increasing. I closed my eyes tighter, visualizing the inside of the drone's tail section. The XM9 used a variable incidence horizontal stabilizer. It was moved by a jack screw, a massive threaded rod that pushed the tail up or down. If the motor was spinning, the 410 Hz hum, but the tail wasn't moving, the pilot shouting, "Why isn't she responding?" Then the connection between the motor and the tail was broken. Clack, clack, clack. That was the sound of the thread skipping. The nut was stripping off the bolt. The motor was spinning freely, grinding the metal threads into dust. I reached for a specific filter, a comb filter. I wanted to hear the texture of the metal. I cranked the volume. Snap. There. Right before the pilot screamed, "Oh God," there was a snap. That was the bolt shearing. The stabilizer went free floating. The drone pitched nose down instantly. It wasn't pilot error. The pilot could have been Chuck Yeager, and he couldn't have saved it. The tail had physically disconnected from the plane. It was a mechanical failure, a maintenance failure. Someone hadn't greased the jack screw, or someone had used a bolt made of cheap alloy. "Thread stripping," I whispered. "The death rattle." I sat back. I looked at the green line on the oscilloscope. It was a flat line now. The recording had ended. I had the proof. The spectral fingerprint of the failure was undeniable to anyone who knew how to read it. The door to the basement slammed open. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Mark stood at the top of the stairs. He was wearing his silk pajamas. His face was red. He looked like a demon backlit by the hallway light. He stomped down the stairs. "You stole it!" Mark screamed. "I woke up and the drive was gone. You senile old thief. That is classified company property. That is federal evidence." He rushed over to the rack. He reached for the USB drive. "Give it to me. I'm calling the police. I'm having you committed, Bill. This is the last straw." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I swiveled my chair slowly. I looked at Mark. I took off my headphones. I placed them gently on the desk. I looked him in the eye. "Sit down, Mark," I said. My voice wasn't the mumble he was used to. It was deep, resonant. It was the voice that had commanded NTSB hearings in Washington for 2 decades. Mark froze. He had never heard me speak like that. "What?" Mark stammered. "I said sit down." I pointed to a folding chair in the corner. Mark didn't sit. He stood there, trembling with rage. "You have no idea what you're messing with. That audio proves the pilot panicked. I have to get that narrative out before morning." "It proves nothing of the sort," I said calmly. I turned back to the oscilloscope. The green trace of the death rattle was frozen on the screen. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the jagged spike. "It's a squiggly line." Mark spat. "It means nothing." "It means everything," I said. "You see this spike at 42 Hz, and this harmonic distortion at 800. I turned the volume knob up. I played the isolated clip, the filtered, amplified sound of the metal shearing. Grrr, snap. The sound filled the basement. It was violent. It sounded like a bone breaking, but louder. Mark flinched. What is that? That, I said, is the sound of an Acme threaded jackscrew stripping its threads under load. I turned to face him. It wasn't the pilot, Mark. The actuator bolt failed. The stabilizer disconnected. The plane committed suicide because your maintenance crew didn't torque the nut or check the lubrication interval. Mark stared at me. His mouth opened and closed. How do you know that? Because I've heard it before, I said. Alaska Airlines Flight 261, January 2000, off the coast of Anacapa Island. 88 people died. It made the exact same sound. I stood up. I was taller than Mark. He often forgot that because I spent so much time sitting down. You are trying to frame a man for manslaughter, I said. But the audio doesn't lie. The pilot was fighting a machine that had already died. Mark stepped back. The colour drained from his face. But, Mark whispered, if it's a mechanical failure, if it's the jackscrew, then the entire fleet is grounded, I finished for him. And Vanguard is liable for criminal negligence, and the stock goes to zero. Mark looked at the oscilloscope. Then he looked at me. The fear in his eyes shifted. It wasn't fear of the crash anymore. It was fear of me. Who are you? Mark whispered. You're just Bill. You sweep the garage. I picked up the USB drive. I held it tight. I'm the listener, I said, and we're going to court. The drive to the National Transportation Safety Board hearing in Washington, D.C. was a study in acoustic contrast. Inside Mark's Audi Q8, the silence was suffocating. The leather seats absorbed the sound. The double-paned glass blocked out the highway wind. The only noise was Mark's breathing, ragged, shallow, the breathing of a man who knows he is driving toward his own execution. He gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. Creak, creak. I sat in the passenger seat. I wasn't looking at Mark. I was looking at the Pelican case on my lap. Inside was my interface, my laptop, and the USB drive. You realize what you're doing, Mark whispered, breaking the silence as we crossed the Potomac. If you're wrong, if that sound is just interference, you're going to destroy the company. Thousands of jobs, my pension, Sarah's future, all gone. I'm not wrong, I said. My voice was low, vibrating against the window glass. The frequency doesn't lie, Mark. Only people do. We pulled up to the hearing building. It was a fortress of grey stone and bureaucracy. A swarm of reporters stood outside, cameras flashing like strobe lights. They were vultures waiting for a carcass. Park in the back, I said. I can't, Mark said. I have to go in the front. I'm the PR director. I have to face them. Park in the back, I repeated. I'm not walking through that mob with this equipment. Mark sighed, a defeated exhalation, and steered the car toward the service entrance. The NTSB hearing room was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous space with high ceilings, acoustic panelling that deadened the air, and a raised dais where the board members sat like judges at the gates of the afterlife. The room was packed. Engineers, lawyers, grieving families, press. The air smelled of stale coffee, wool suits, and anxiety. I stood at the back of the room, near the sound booth. Mark had slipped away to join his legal team at the front. I was wearing my old trench coat. It was frayed at the cuffs. I hadn't shaved in 2 days. To the security guard standing next to me, I looked like a vagrant who had wandered in from the street to get warm. "Sir," the guard whispered, stepping in front of me. "This is a closed session for credentialed personnel only. You need to leave." I didn't leave. I watched the dais. At the center of the table sat Director Elias Vance. I knew Elias. We'd worked the TWA 800 crash together in '96. We had stood on the deck of a salvage ship in the Atlantic, listening to the underwater locator beacons pinging from the abyss. He was a young investigator then. Now he was the chairman. His hair was white, but his eyes were still sharp. On the witness stand, the CEO of Vanguard Aviation, Julian Sterling, was testifying. Sterling was polished. He was handsome in a way that polled well with focus groups. He spoke with a smooth baritone cadence that projected confidence. "Director Vance," Sterling said, leaning into the microphone. "Vanguard Aviation prides itself on safety. The XM9 drone is a marvel of autonomous engineering. Its logic core has logged 10,000 hours without a single fault." Sterling paused for effect. He looked at the gallery. He looked specifically at a woman in the front row. She was young, crying quietly, holding a picture of a man in a flight suit. The pilot's wife. "The data is clear," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a somber register. "The remote operator, mister." Evans disengaged the autopilot at 1402. He was under stress. He was fatigued. He pulled back on the stick too hard, inducing an accelerated stall. The machine did exactly what it was told to do. It is a tragedy, yes, but it is a human tragedy, not a mechanical one. The room murmured. The narrative was setting. Concrete. Heavy. The pilot was the villain. Vanguard was the victim. "We have the CVDR audio," Sterling added. "It captures Mr. Evans screaming in panic. It captures his confusion. It is the sound of a man who has lost control." Director Vance nodded slowly. He looked at the file in front of him. "We have reviewed the audio, Mr. Sterling," Vance said. "It is indeed disturbing. The screaming indicates a loss of situational awareness." "Exactly," Sterling said. "We request that the board rule this as pilot error and close the docket." I moved. I stepped past the security guard. "Hey," the guard shouted. "Stop." He grabbed my arm. I didn't stop. I kept walking down the center aisle. My footsteps were heavy. My pelican case banged against my leg. Thud. Thud. The room went silent. The murmuring stopped. Every head turned. "Get him out of here!" Sterling shouted from the stand. "Security!" 2 more guards rushed towards me from the front. I stopped in the middle of the aisle. I looked up at the dais. I looked at Elias Vance. Vance looked down. He squinted. The lights were bright. He saw the old coat. He saw the grey stubble. Then he saw the eyes. Vance froze. He took off his glasses. He leaned forward. "Wait," Vance said. His voice echoed through the microphone. "Director," Sterling protested. "This man is a disruptor. He's clearly mentally ill." "Stand down," Vance ordered the guards. Vance stood up. He walked around the table to the edge of the dais. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and reverence. "Bill?" Vance whispered. I nodded. "Director Vance," I said. My voice was raspy, unused to projecting in a room this size. "I apologize for the intrusion. But your audio analysis is incomplete." "Incomplete?" Sterling scoffed. "Who is this?" Vance looked at Sterling. "This is William Halloway. He was the lead acoustics investigator for the NTSB for 30 years. He wrote the manual on spectral analysis that your engineers use today. Vance looked back at me. We thought you were retired, Bill. We thought you were gone. I am retired, I said, but I still listen. I lifted the heavy case. May I approach the AV console director? I have a rebuttal. Vance didn't hesitate. Grant him access. Connect him to the main house system. Objection! Sterling's lawyer jumped up. This is highly irregular. This evidence hasn't been submitted to discovery. It's an inquest, not a trial, Counselor, Vance snapped. I want to hear what he has to say. Set it up, Bill. I walked to the AV desk at the side of the room. The young technician sitting there looked terrified. He scrambled out of his chair. Give me the XLR feed, I said. He handed me the cable. I opened my case. I plugged in my interface. I booted up my laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dim room. I felt the eyes of everyone on me. I felt Mark cowering in the front row. I felt the CEO's glare burning into my back. But I was in my element now. The wires, the signal, the flow. Ladies and gentlemen, I said into the technician's microphone, the human ear is a flawed instrument. It prioritizes volume over frequency. It hears what it expects to hear. Mr. Sterling expects you to hear a pilot screaming. I loaded the file. The waveform appeared on the main projector screen behind the dais, a jagged green mountain range of sound. This is the raw audio from the CVDR, I said. Let's listen. I hit the spacebar. Screesh. The sound blasted through the courtroom speakers. It was deafening. The wind noise, the alarms, the screaming pilot. It was chaos. It sounded like death. The pilot's wife covered her ears and sobbed. Sterling looked smug. See? Chaos. Panic. I stopped the playback. Noise, I said. That is just noise. Now let's remove the distraction. I opened my plug-in window on the screen. A parametric equalizer. I am applying a high-pass filter at 200 Hz, I narrated, turning a virtual knob. This removes the wind buffeting. I hit play. The screeching wind vanished. The audio was thinner, clearer. Now, I said, I am applying a notch filter at 1.2 kHz. This is the frequency of the pull-up alarm. I dragged the node down. The blaring siren disappeared from the mix. And finally, I said, I am gating the vocal track. I am removing the pilot's voice. The screaming vanished. The room was silent. Now, I said, what is left? I cranked the master volume fader to the maximum. Listen to the room tone, I whispered. I hit play. At first, the audience heard nothing, just a low hum. Then, they felt it. A vibration in the floorboards. A deep, grinding rhythm. Do you hear that? I asked. Frequency 410 Hz. That is the AC motor of the horizontal stabilizer trim actuator. So? Sterling interrupted. The motor was running. The pilot was trying to trim the nose up. That proves he was fighting the controls. Wait, I said. I pointed to the screen, to the spectral view, a heat map of the sound frequencies. Look at the subharmonic, I said. Right there, at 42 Hz. A faint, rhythmic clicking sound emerged from the speakers. That, I said, is the sound of the threads on the jack screw skipping. The nut is stripping. The motor is turning, but it isn't moving the tail. It's eating the bolt. I looked at the CEO. And then, I said, the moments of failure. I let the audio run. The clacking got faster, louder. Clack, 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 grrr. And then, the sound that would haunt everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. Snap. It wasn't a soft sound. Even through the filters, it was a violent, metallic gunshot. It was the sound of steel shearing under 10 tons of pressure. Whirr! The motor spun freely. A high-pitched whine. No resistance. I hit stop. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavier than the noise had been. The snap occurred at timestamp 14:02:10, I said. The pilot didn't scream until 14:02:12. The tail had already disconnected before he realized something was wrong. I turned to the dais. The stabilizer failed, Director. The bolts sheared. The pilot was flying a paperweight. Director Vance looked pale. He looked at the spectral graph on the screen. Mr. Sterling, Vance said, his voice cold. Do you have an explanation for this acoustic signature? Sterling stood up. He was sweating now. The Polish was cracking. This is voodoo science, Sterling stammered. He's manipulating the audio. He's adding sounds that aren't there. That click could be anything. It could be a loose pen in the cockpit. It could be interference. It's not interference, I said. I reached into my bag. I pulled out a large, rolled-up sheet of paper. I walked to the dais and laid it out in front of Vance. This, I said, pointing to the paper, is the spectral graph of Alaska Airlines Flight 261. The NTSB database, file number DCA00MA023. I pointed to the screen. And this is the spectral graph of your drone. I overlaid them. The fingerprints were identical. The 42 Hz click. The 400 Hz hum. The specific decay rate of the snap. It is a match, I said. A perfect mechanical match. The same failure mode. The same geometry. The same physics. I turned to Sterling. Jack screw assemblies require lubrication every 600 flight hours, I said. If you skip the lubrication, the friction increases. The metal heats up. The threads strip. It sings a song before it dies, Mr. Sterling. The death rattle. We just heard it. I looked at Mark, who was sitting with his head in his hands. Mark told me the logic core had 10,000 hours, I said. Did the airframe have 10,000 hours? Because if you put a smart brain in a body you didn't maintain, it doesn't matter how good the code is. Sterling looked around the room. He saw the reporters typing furiously. He saw the pilot's wife looking at him with pure hatred. He saw his legal team closing their laptops, distancing themselves from the blast radius. Sterling choked. We have a predictive maintenance schedule. The AI monitors the vibration levels. It would have flagged an anomaly. The AI listens for digital errors, I said. It doesn't listen to the metal. It filters out the noise, just like you did. I unplugged my laptop. The screen on the wall went black. You killed those people to save 4 hours of grease time, I said quietly. Director, Sterling pleaded. I object. This is speculation. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Vance barked. This hearing is suspended. I'm ordering an immediate forensic analysis of the wreckage, specifically the jack screw assembly, and I'm ordering the grounding of the entire XM9 fleet, effective immediately. The gavel banged. Bang! It sounded just like the snap on the tape. Pandemonium erupted. Reporters rushed the aisle. Lawyers shouted. I didn't stay. I packed my interface. I wound my cable. I closed the Pelican case. I walked back up the aisle. The pilot's wife stood up as I passed. She was crying, but these were different tears. tears of relief, tears of vindication. She reached out and touched my arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening to him." I nodded. "He did everything he could, Mom. He was a good pilot." I walked out the back door. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of a vacuum after an explosion. Mark drove. He was shaking. His hands were gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "It's over," Mark whispered. "Vanguard, the stock, my options, it's all going to zero. They'll indict Sterling. They might indict me for the press release." He looked at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. "You destroyed it all, Bill, in 10 minutes. You took apart $1 billion company with a laptop and a pair of headphones." "I didn't destroy anything," I said, looking out the window at the passing streetlights. "The bolt was already broken, Mark. I just turned on the lights." "But why?" Mark asked. "Why did you care? You said in that basement. You ignore the world. Why did you come out for this?" "Because of the frequency," I said. I tapped my ear. "The truth has a frequency, Mark. It vibrates. It resonates. You can try to bury it under noise. You can try to talk over it with PR spin and stock prices. But the signal is always there. And eventually someone is going to tune in." Mark looked at the road. He began to cry. Soft, pathetic sobs. He was mourning his ambition. He was realizing that he had spent his life building a castle on a foundation of lies, and a blind old man had just pulled the keystone. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered. "I'm sorry I called you deaf." "I'm not deaf," I said. "I just don't like what I hear most of the time." We pulled into the driveway. I got out of the car. I didn't wait for him. I walked into the house. Sarah was in the kitchen, watching the news. Her mouth was open. The TV showed the headline, "Whistleblower exposes Vanguard crash." The death rattle. She looked at me. She looked at the Pelican case in my hand. "Dad?" she asked. Was that you?" I didn't answer. I just walked past her. I opened the basement door. The smell of dust and ozone welcomed me. I walked down the stairs. I closed the heavy oak door behind me. The seal engaged. Thump! The noise of the world was gone. The noise of the crying CEO. The noise of the reporters. The noise of my son-in-law's crumbling ego. It was just the room tone. I walked to my rack. I put the Pelican case on the floor. I sat in my Aeron chair. I picked up my Sony MDR 7506S. I put them on. I didn't play any music. I didn't play any tapes. I just sat there, encased in the acoustic foam, protected from the signal. I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath. Finally, I whispered, "Quiet."